The young elephant mocked an old rhino just to show off. What happened next shocked the entire herd. The young bull's trunk shot forward like a whip, striking the mud just inches from the rhino's face. Wet earth exploded across the ancient creature's scarred horn, across the milky cataract that clouded his left eye. The elephant trumpeted, high, sharp, mocking, and the sound cut through the afternoon heat like breaking glass. Around the waterhole, heads lifted. Zebras paused mid-drink. A sacred ibis took flight. And the old rhino, massive and gray as storm clouds, simply stood there, water dripping from his jaw. His good eye fixed on something beyond the young fool before him, beyond the watching herd, beyond perhaps even the acacia-dotted horizon itself. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The waterhole lay like a broken mirror beneath the African sun, its surface shattered into 1,000 fragments by the movements of those who depended on it. This was the dry season's 3rd month, when the great Mara River had withdrawn into itself, leaving only scattered pools and the desperate mathematics of survival. Every creature knew the calculus: drink quickly, drink carefully, or don't drink at all. Keto had never learned careful. At 12 years old, the young bull elephant stood at the peculiar intersection of youth and emerging power. Old enough to have left his mother's immediate shadow, young enough to believe the world owed him deference. His tusks, still short and ivory bright, had only recently begun their outward curve. His ears, vast and thin as parchment, bore not a single scar from thorn or territorial dispute. He moved through the world with the dangerous confidence of those who have never truly been tested. The herd matriarch, Nyota, had positioned herself and the females at the waterhole's eastern edge, where the bank sloped gently and the young calves could wade without risk. Her daughter, Amara, stood belly-deep with her 3-month-old calf, the tiny creature's trunk barely coordinated enough to draw water without inhaling half of it. The scene was ordinary, ancient, part of the rhythm that had governed this land since before humans carved their first images into stone. Keto approached from the north, flanked by 2 other young bulls, Jabari and Tendai, both nearly his age, both caught in the same dangerous current of adolescence. They moved with exaggerated swagger, trunks swinging, occasionally shoving each other in performative displays of strength that carried no real intent. That's when Keto saw him. The rhino stood at the southern bank, alone as his kind so often were, his massive body casting a shadow that seemed too solid for the shimmering heat. He was old, impossibly old by the standards of his species. His horn, once perhaps majestic, had been broken in some long-ago battle, leaving only a blunted stub. His hide bore the mapped history of decades, parallel scars from territorial fights, circular marks from parasite infestations long healed, and the strange smoothness that comes when skin has weathered so many seasons it seems almost polished. But it was the eye that marked him most clearly. His left eye had gone milky with age, the cataract rendering it useless except perhaps for the vaguest sense of light and shadow. He compensated by turning his head frequently, keeping his good right eye oriented toward potential threats, but the gesture gave him an air of perpetual wariness, as if he were always looking for something just out of reach. The local herds knew him, though none knew his history. He had simply appeared at these territories 3 seasons ago, alone, and had remained alone. Unlike the social elephants, rhinos carried their solitude like armor. This one, the younger elephants had taken to calling him Kifaru, simply Rhino in Swahili, for they knew no other name for him, seemed to wear his isolation with a particular heaviness. Keto saw opportunity. "Watch this," he rumbled to Jabari, the subsonic frequency carrying his intent even before his actions made it clear. He broke from his companions and approached the waterhole with deliberate loudness, each footfall heavy, trunk raised high. The matriarch's ear flipped in his direction, a warning, subtle but clear. Keto ignored it. He was technically beyond her direct authority now, old enough to make his own foolish choices, young enough to believe they wouldn't carry consequences. The old rhino registered his approach, but didn't move, didn't even turn his head fully. He simply continued drinking, his prehensile upper lip drawing water in with patient, methodical efficiency. His good eye tracked Keto's peripheral movement, calculated threat level, apparently found it wanting. That dismissal stung worse than any challenge would have. Keto accelerated, his ears spreading wide in a display meant to maximize his apparent size. He trumpeted again, that same sharp, juvenile sound, and several of the younger calves startled, pressing against their mother's legs. Nyota took 3 steps toward him, her trunk rising in genuine warning now, but Keto was already committed to his performance. He reached the water's edge, 6 body lengths from the rhino, and, with theatrical aggression, began to dig with his front foot, sending cascades of mud and water toward the old creature. The rhino's ear twitched, irritation, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. Still, he didn't move. Emboldened, Keto did something that would later seem incomprehensible even to himself. He sucked his trunk full of the muddy water and, with deliberate aim, sprayed it directly across the rhino's face. The mud struck the broken horn, spattered across the scarred hide, and, for a moment, just a moment, the ancient creature's good eye closed as if against not the mud, but the sheer stupidity of the gesture. Behind Keto, Jabari released a nervous rumble that might have been laughter or might have been warning. Tendai had gone utterly still, his trunk curled tight against his chest in the elephant equivalent of holding one's breath. The waterhole fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause. Nyota's massive form shifted, preparing to intervene, but she stopped, arrested by something in the tableau before her. The old rhino raised his head slowly, very slowly, water and mud streaming from his jaw. He turned, bringing his good eye to bear fully on the young elephant before him. And in that eye, dark, depthless, carrying the weight of years Keto couldn't begin to imagine, there was no anger. There was something far worse. Pity. Not the pity of the strong for the weak, but the profound sadness of one who recognizes in another's cruelty the exact shape of their own lost youth. The old rhino looked at Keto the way one might look at a sunset on a day when you've learned someone you loved has died. Seeing the beauty, yes, but through the lens of all that's been irretrievably lost. Then, he did something no one expected. He turned away, turned his scarred, mud-splattered back on the young elephant, and began to walk toward the far edge of the waterhole, his gait stiff with arthritis, but steady, unhurried. Not fleeing, simply leaving, granting Keto the empty victory of the unopposed. The other young bulls erupted in triumphant bellows. Jabari rushed forward to bump shoulders with Keto, and even Tendai allowed himself a small trumpet of approval. See how the mighty rhino fled! See how Keto had driven him off! But Keto, standing there with mud still dripping from his trunk, felt something cold settle in his chest. The matriarch's eyes found his across the water, and in them he saw not anger, but disappointment, that most withering of emotional judgments. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply turned back to her daughter and grandcalf, resuming the essential business of survival. And in that turning away, Keto felt himself diminished in ways he didn't yet have the wisdom to articulate. The old rhino reached the far bank and paused there, just for a moment, his head turning to bring his good eye back across the waterhole. Looking not at Keto specifically, but at the herd, at the water, at the ancient dance of need and territory, and the small cruelties that punctuate the hours between birth and death. Then he was gone, disappearing into the scrub with surprising quietness for a creature of his bulk. The sun continued its arc. The waterhole's surface settled. Life resumed its patterns, because life always does, because it must. But something had shifted. Some small stone had been displaced in the architecture of the world. And though no one could have named it then, they all felt it. The sense that this moment, this stupid small moment of a young elephant's thoughtless arrogance, had set in motion currents that would pull them all towards some inevitable reckoning. Keto drank his fill, surrounded by his admirers, and tried to ignore the hollow feeling that had settled where triumph should have been. 3 days passed. The waterhole shrank further. The herds came and went in their careful rotations, each group taking what they needed and yielding to the next, the ancient protocol of survival. The old rhino didn't return. On the 4th day, Keto and his companions ventured further afield, following Noyata's herd as they migrated toward new grazing grounds. The matriarch had decided to move the family unit north, where scouts reported better grass near the hills. The journey would take them through unfamiliar territory, past the boundaries where elephant presence was routine and into the contested spaces where predators held stronger claim. They traveled in the cooler hours of early morning, and it was Tendai who first scented something wrong. His trunk went up, testing the air with the sophisticated olfactory analysis that made elephants perhaps the world's greatest natural chemists. "Blood," he rumbled, the subsonic frequency carrying to every member of the herd. Fresh, and something else. Nyota altered course immediately, angling toward a dense copse of fever trees where the scent seemed concentrated. The whole herd followed, driven by that particular elephant compulsion to investigate death, to understand it, to remember it. They found the old rhino in a clearing barely wide enough for his potty. He was down on his side, his legs arranged in the awkward geometry of a creature that had collapsed rather than lain down with intent. His flanks heaved with labored breathing, each exhale releasing a wet sound that spoke of internal damage. His good eye was open, tracking their approach with dull awareness. 3 lionesses watched from the clearing's edge, their muzzles dark with blood, their eyes calculating. This had been their kill, or attempted kill. The rhino's thick hide and the broken horn had made for a longer, more desperate battle than they'd anticipated. Deep claw marks scored his shoulders and haunches, one rear leg bent at an angle that spoke of torn ligaments or worse. But he lived. Stubbornly, impossibly, he lived. The lionesses snarled at the elephant's approach, a sound caught between aggression and uncertainty. 3 against 1 dying rhino was fair odds. 3 against a herd of elephants was suicide. After a moment's calculation, the cats melted back into the brush, taking their frustration with them. They'd return later when the elephants had moved on, to finish what they'd started. Nyota approached to within 2 body lengths of the fallen rhino, her trunk extended in careful examination. She could smell the extent of his injuries, the torn muscles, the blood pooling beneath his skin, the particular scent that presaged death. Her assessment was swift and sure. He would not rise again. This clearing would be his final territory. She rumbled something low and complex, a sound that carried layers of meaning her herd would understand, even if no human could have translated it. Acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even apology for the cruelty of the world that brought all things, eventually, to such endings. The old rhino's good eye found her, held her gaze for a moment. Then, with visible effort, it shifted, searching the gathered elephants until it found Quito. The young bull stood at the formation's edge, struck motionless by a combination of fascination and something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. He'd never seen death in process before, had seen the bones of the fallen, yes, the picked clean remains that dotted the savannah like botanical specimens, but never this. The terrible transition, the moments when the world still held you, but had already begun to let go. The rhino looked at him, and Quito realized with sudden, absolute certainty that the old creature remembered him, remembered the waterhole, the mud, the mockery. And in that recognition, Quito felt the full weight of his earlier actions crash down upon him. This being before him, this dying thing, with its scarred hide and broken horn and clouded eye, had once been young, had once been strong, had survived decades of drought and predators and territorial wars, only to fall here, alone, miles from whatever birthplace had first shaped him. And Quito had mocked him. Had seen all that accumulated survival, all that patient endurance, and had chosen to make it the subject of entertainment. Nyota began to turn away, preparing to lead the herd onward. The living must continue. The rhino was not of their kind, not their responsibility. Nature had rendered its verdict, and nature's verdicts were not subject to appeal. But Quito didn't move. "We can't leave him," he rumbled, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought behind them. Nyota's head swung toward him, trunk curling in a gesture of profound incredulity. "He is not our concern. He'll die." "Yes," her tone carried the finality of stone. "All things die. He has lived long. He will die now. This is the way. The lions are also living, also hungry, also following the way." Nyota's patience, vast as it was, had limits. "We move on." The herd began to shift, orienting themselves northward once more. Jabari bumped Quito's shoulder in passing, a gesture meant to pull him back into the group's momentum. Even Tendai, who often showed more thoughtfulness than the others, kept walking. Quito looked back at the rhino, at the labored breathing, at the blood-darkened earth, at the good eye that still held some terrible awareness, at the proof that youth and mockery and cruel entertainment ended here, in this clearing, alone. He made a choice that defied instinct, tradition, and sense. "I'll stay," he said. Nyota stopped, turned fully, and in her ancient eyes, Quito saw something that might have been the first glimmer of respect she'd ever offered him. Why? He didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, didn't have words for the knot of guilt and fascination and something else, something that felt like the first adult emotion of his life, that held him rooted to this spot. So he said the only true thing he could. "I don't know." The matriarch regarded him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, she dipped her trunk in a gesture of acknowledgement. 2 days, she rumbled. "The herd cannot wait longer. If you do not return to us by the second sunset, you will have chosen a different path." "I understand. Do you?" Her tone suggested she doubted it, but she said no more. She turned, and the herd followed her, and within minutes the sound of their passage had faded into the general acoustic texture of the savanna, leaving Quito alone with the dying rhino and the gathering heat of midday. The young elephant stood there, his shadow falling across the rhino's scarred flank, and wondered what exactly he thought he was going to do. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The first hour passed in a silence broken only by the rhino's labored breathing and the harsh cries of vultures beginning to circle overhead. Quito had never felt so alone, so acutely aware of his own skin as a boundary between self and the immense indifference of the world. He was a social creature abandoned to solitude, standing watch over a being who had chosen, or been forced into, solitude as a way of life. What did one do exactly when keeping vigil over death? He started with the practical. The sun's heat would be deadly for both of them without shade, and the rhino's position offered none. Quito moved to the fever trees at the clearing's edge and began to break branches, careful to select those already dead or dying, using his trunk and the pressure of his body to snap them free. He arranged them over the rhino's exposed flank, creating a rough lattice that filtered the worst of the direct sunlight. The old creature's good eye tracked these movements with what might have been confusion or might have been simple passive observation. He was beyond protesting, beyond even the energy required for suspicion. When Quito's shadow fell across him during the branch placement, he simply endured it, the way he had endured everything else, in stoic, silent acceptance. "I'm sorry," Quito said, though he knew the rhino couldn't understand the words. But perhaps tone carried some meaning across the species barrier. For the waterhole, for being stupid. No response. Just the wet, rhythmic breathing that sounded worse with each cycle. Quito remembered the water he'd carried in his trunk. Not much, but some. He approached cautiously, extending his trunk toward the rhino's mouth. The creature's upper lip twitched, an involuntary response, and Quito carefully released a small stream. Most of it missed, running down the rhino's jaw to darken the earth, but some found its mark. The swallowing reflex engaged, weak but present. Encouraged, Quito made 3 trips to a small seasonal stream he'd scented about a half-mile east, each time carrying what water he could in his trunk and carefully administering it to the fallen rhino. It was inefficient, probably pointless, but it gave him purpose in a situation that otherwise offered none. By late afternoon, the clearing had become an oven. The makeshift shade helped, but Quito could see the rhino's distress increasing. Flies had discovered the wounds, clustering in black, writhing masses that the old creature lacked the strength to dislodge. Quito used his ears to fan them away, creating air currents that temporarily dispersed the insects, though they always returned. He tried to remember everything he'd learned from watching Yota and the other elders tend to injured herd members. Elephants were sophisticated physicians when their own kind was hurt. They understood poultices, the cooling properties of mud, even seemed to recognize which plants held antiseptic properties. But this wasn't an elephant, and Quito's knowledge felt pitifully inadequate. Still, he tried. He plastered mud from the stream bed across the worst of the claw marks, the cool earth at least offering some relief from the burning invasion of infection. The rhino tolerated this with the same passive acceptance as everything else, his good eye sometimes closing for long minutes, then opening again as if surprised to find himself still tethered to consciousness. Night came suddenly, as it does in the equatorial regions, the sun dropping below the horizon and taking the light with it as if a switch had been thrown. The temperature plummeted, and Quito found himself grateful for the hours of heat he'd endured. Now, cold became the enemy. The sounds of the savanna at night wove around them, the sawing cough of a distant leopard, the maniacal giggling of hyenas on some far hunt. The smaller, closer rustlings of rodents and insects conducting their own desperate business of survival. Keto's ears swiveled constantly, tracking threats, assessing dangers. His heart rate elevated every time large predators sounded too close, but none approached the clearing. Perhaps his scent, still fresh and strong, deterred them. Or perhaps they simply sensed something in this configuration, young elephant and dying rhino, that didn't fit the normal calculus of hunter and prey. Somewhere past midnight, the rhino spoke. It wasn't words, of course, just a sound, low and grinding, that emerged from deep in his chest. Pain, maybe, or protest at still being conscious when unconsciousness would have been kinder. The sound cut through Keto with unexpected force, and he found himself moving closer, positioning his bulk against the rhino's back in a configuration that mimicked the way young elephants slept pressed against their mothers. The old rhino's breathing changed fractionally, still labored, still wet, but perhaps marginally easier with the warmth and solid presence against his spine. Keto felt the rib cage expand and contract against his shoulder, felt the tremors that occasionally racked the heavy body, felt the fundamental wrongness of a creature this powerful reduced to such vulnerability. "You're not dying tonight," Keto rumbled, knowing it was probably a lie, but needing to say it anyway. "I won't let you." Dawn came in stages. First, the false light that only made the stars more visible. Then the gradual graying of the eastern horizon. Finally, the sudden spill of gold that transformed the landscape from monochrome to full color in a matter of minutes. Keto had dozed intermittently, never fully sleeping, always some part of his awareness tracking the rhino's breathing for any change that might signal the final transition. But morning found them both alive. The old creature's good eye opened as the light increased, and for the first time since the attack, Keto saw something in it that resembled active consciousness rather than mere endurance. The rhino turned his head fractionally, bringing Keto into fuller view, and the young elephant saw the question forming in that dark eye. "Why are you still here?" Keto didn't have an answer, not one that made sense anyway. He was supposed to be with his herd, supposed to be learning from Yota and the others, supposed to be navigating the complex social dynamics that would determine his place in the hierarchy for years to come. Instead, he was here, in a clearing that smelled of blood and earth and the peculiar sweetness that preceded rot, keeping company with a creature who would likely be dead within hours. Yet, when he examined his feelings, he found no desire to leave. The day established its own rhythm. Keto made water runs, administered what he could, maintained the shade structure, kept the flies at bay. The rhino seemed marginally more alert, occasionally shifting his weight in what might have been attempts at comfort or might have been the body's involuntary resistance to staying in one position too long. The swelling in the injured leg had increased dramatically overnight, and Keto could smell infection beginning its work. Around midday, he heard the lions returning. They approached with more caution this time, 3 shapes materializing from the scrub with the liquid grace of their kind. The same females from yesterday, drawn back by scent and memory, and the knowledge that their prey had been here, should still be here, should by now be considerably weaker. They pulled up short when they saw Keto standing over the rhino, his ears spread wide, his trunk raised in unmistakable warning. The largest lioness, the pride's likely leader, her face scarred from previous hunts, assessed the situation with pragmatic calculation. She could see the rhino was down, could probably smell that his condition had worsened. Easy prey under normal circumstances. But the elephant was a complication, a variable that shifted the equation from simple to potentially costly. She growled, low and questioning. The other 2 fanned out slightly, testing for weakness, for opportunity. Keto trumpeted, the sound explosive in the clearing's confines, and charged 3 steps forward. It was bluff. He'd never actually fought a predator, wouldn't know how to do more than rely on his bulk and hope his inexperience didn't get him killed. But the bluff was convincing enough. The lionesses exchanged glances, some communication passing between them that Keto couldn't interpret, and withdrew. Not far. He could still sense them in the surrounding scrub, patient and unhurried. They had time. They would wait. The day ground on. Keto found himself talking to the rhino, filling the silence with one-sided conversation because the alternative was to sit with his own thoughts, which had become increasingly circular and self-accusatory. He told the old creature about the herd, about Nyota's wisdom and his mother's protective nature before he'd left her group. He described the waterhole, leaving out his own role in their previous encounter, as if the rhino might somehow have forgotten. "Jabari says I talk too much," Keto rumbled at one point. "Says I should listen more." "He's probably right. Elephants are supposed to be good listeners. We remember everything, they say. Every sound, every scent, every path we've ever walked. Matriarchs can remember migrations from when they were calves, can lead the herd to water sources they haven't visited in decades." The rhino's breathing had steadied somewhat, though it still carried that wet quality that suggested fluid in the lungs. His good eye was open, tracking a hornbill that had landed in one of the fever trees, the bird's raucous call cutting through the afternoon heat. "I wonder what you remember," Keto continued. "How old are you? 30 years? 40? Longer? You must have seen things. Droughts worse than this one. Predators. Maybe humans too, with their noise and metal and the way they change everything they touch." He paused, considering. "We're supposed to fear humans more than anything. Nyota says they're the most dangerous predators because they kill not from hunger but from want, and want has no limits the way hunger does. But you don't fear them now, do you? You don't fear anything. You're just tired." The rhino's eye closed slowly, then opened again. Agreement? Understanding? Or simply the random movements of a creature too far gone for intentional communication? That night, the lionesses tried again. They came in the dark hours before dawn, when Keto's attention was at its lowest ebb. He'd been dozing, his trunk resting across the rhino's shoulder in a gesture that had become almost habitual, when a sound brought him to full alertness. Not a dramatic sound, just the subtle displacement of grass that meant something large was moving with deliberate stealth. He lurched to his feet, nearly stepping on the rhino in his haste, and trumpeted a challenge into the darkness. For a moment, nothing. Then eyes reflected his sound back at him. 3 pairs, spaced in a formation that suggested coordination, strategy. They rushed him from different angles, not attacking directly, but testing his resolve, his ability to defend multiple vectors simultaneously. Keto spun and charged and made himself as large and loud as possible, relying on intimidation because he had nothing else. One lioness got close enough that he could smell the carnivore reek of her breath, could see the muscles bunching in her shoulders for a leap that would take her to his throat or spine. He caught her with his trunk, the appendage wrapping around her body more from luck than skill, and flung her sideways with strength he didn't know he possessed. She hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up snarling but visibly shaken. The other 2 froze, recalculating. Then, behind Keto, the rhino made a sound. It was deep, primal, a bass note that seemed to resonate in the bones. Not loud, not by elephant or lion standards, but carrying a quality that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to some ancient part of the brain, where prey recognized predator and the strong acknowledged the strong. The rhino couldn't rise, could barely move, but he could still produce that sound. And in it, the lionesses heard what Keto heard, the voice of something that refused to yield, that would go down fighting if it went down at all, and would take pieces of them with it. The moment balanced on a knife edge. Then the lead lioness huffed, a sound of frustration and dismissal, and turned away. The others followed. Within seconds, they'd melted back into the darkness, taking their hunger elsewhere. Keto stood there shaking, adrenaline flooding his system with energy he no longer needed. He'd won. He'd actually won. Defended the rhino, defended himself, held ground against one of the savanna's apex predators. He looked down at the old creature, expecting what? Gratitude? Acknowledgement? The rhino's good eye was already closing again, his body settling back into the shallow rhythm of labored rest. The moment of defiance had cost him dearly. Keto could see new tremors running through the heavy frame, the price of summoning strength that no longer existed. But just before the eye closed completely, it found Keto's, and in it, the young elephant saw something that might have been respect. Dawn of the second day arrived with a sky the color of old bruises, heavy clouds pressing down from the north, rain, perhaps, though the scent wasn't quite right for it yet. Keto realized with a start that this was his deadline. Noyota had given him until the second sunset, and the herd would be far to the north by now, perhaps beyond his ability to track even with his sophisticated sense of smell and spatial memory. He should leave, should abandon this vigil and run north, cover ground while he still could, rejoin the family structure that had defined his entire existence. Every instinct bred over millions of years of evolution screamed at him to do exactly that. Instead, he stayed. The rhino's condition had deteriorated noticeably overnight. The infection had bloomed, visible now as dark streaks radiating from the claw marks. His breathing had gone shallow and rapid, the body's desperate attempt to compensate for lungs that were failing. The good eye opened less frequently, and when it did, it seemed to focus on nothing in particular. Keto renewed his efforts with water, with shade, with the simple presence of his body between the dying creature and the world's casual cruelty. It felt inadequate, felt like trying to hold back the tide with his trunk, but what else could he do? Around mid-morning, something changed. The rhino's breathing hitched, then steadied into a different pattern, deeper, slower, as if the body had finally exhausted its resistance and accepted what was coming. His good eye opened and turned toward Keto with unusual clarity. The cloudiness that had characterized the past day suddenly gone, replaced by a lucidity that was somehow worse because it suggested understanding, acceptance, goodbye. "No," Keto said, the word emerging as a low rumble. "Not yet. You can't. You fought the lions. You made them leave. You're strong enough to—" But the rhino wasn't looking at him anymore. His gaze had shifted skyward, tracking something Keto couldn't see. Clouds, perhaps? Or some memory of a sky he'd known before cataracts and age had stolen the sharpness from his vision. His breathing slowed further, each inhale taking longer to arrive, each exhale releasing with a sound like settling sand. Keto pressed his trunk to the rhino's cheek, feeling the heat of fever, the subtle tremors that suggested systems shutting down in sequence. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words as inadequate now as they'd been at the waterhole. More inadequate because now he understood exactly what he was apologizing for. Not just his own cruelty, but the fundamental cruelty of a world that let beings accumulate so much time and wisdom and endurance, only to have it all drain away, in a clearing miles from anywhere that mattered. The rhino's breath caught one final time, held, released, and didn't return. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The silence that followed was total, absolute, the kind of quiet that seems to expand beyond simple absence of sound into something almost physical. Keto stood motionless, his trunk still resting against the rhino's cooling skin, and waited for something to happen, for the creature to draw another breath, for the universe to acknowledge this transition with thunder or wind, or some sign that a life had ended here. Nothing came. The world continued in its regular patterns, indifferent to the small death that had just occurred beneath the fever trees. The hornbill called from its perch. Insects droned in the afternoon heat. Somewhere in the distance, a herd of impala moved through dry grass with the sound of rainfall that would never come. Keto stepped back, his legs suddenly unsteady. He had seen death before. Carcasses scattered across the landscape, bones picked clean by scavengers. The elephant graveyard where his grandmother's remains lay among those of ancestors he'd never known. But this was different. This was death he'd witnessed from beginning to end. Death he'd tried and failed to prevent. Death that felt somehow personal in a way the dried bones of strangers never had. The rhino lay exactly as he died, his good eye still open, already beginning to cloud with the film that came within minutes of the final breath. His scarred hide, marked by decades of survival, had become just that, hide, no longer animated by the stubborn consciousness that had inhabited it. The transformation from being to thing happened so quickly, so completely, that Keto found himself shocked all over again by the absoluteness of it. He did what elephants do in the presence of their own dead. He investigated. His trunk moved over the rhino's body carefully, systematically, as if detailed examination might reveal some secret the living creature had withheld. He touched the broken horn, the clouded eye, the cooling skin. He committed every detail to memory with the comprehensive attention that characterized his species' legendary recall. And in that examination, he found something unexpected. On the rhino's right shoulder, partially hidden beneath the dried blood and mud Keto had applied for the wounds, was a mark. Not a natural marking, not scarring from combat or the random patterns of hide coloration. This was deliberate, artificial, a brand in the shape of two overlapping circles, healed years ago but still visible as slightly paler skin against the gray hide. Keto had seen such marks before, though not often. Humans made them, burning their symbols into animals they considered property. Nyota had explained this once, her voice carrying layers of disgust and pity. Some rhinos were captured young, she said, held in human territories called reserves or sanctuaries, marked and tracked and sometimes released back into the wild. Many died in captivity. Those that survived often bore these brands as permanent proof of human contact. So the old rhino hadn't always been wild, or rather, had been wild, then captured, then released again. A full cycle of freedom, imprisonment, and return that explained, perhaps, the particular quality of his solitude. He'd known both worlds and found himself belonging fully to neither. Keto felt the information settle in his chest like a stone. The rhino's loneliness took on new dimensions. He hadn't just been old and alone. He'd been damaged in ways that went beyond the physical, carrying the psychological scars of displacement and captivity that Keto was only beginning to understand. "Who were you?" he asked the silent form. "Before the humans? After them? What did you remember when you looked at that water hole? What were you trying to forget?" No answers came, would ever come. The dead kept their secrets. The rest of that day passed in a strange fugue state. Keto knew he should leave, should begin the journey north toward where the herd might be, but something held him in the clearing. Partially it was exhaustion. 2 days of constant vigilance had depleted him more than he'd realized. Partially it was the sense that leaving now would constitute abandonment, though the rhino was beyond caring about such things. But mostly was the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in him during these 2 days. He'd arrived at this clearing as a thoughtless youth who believed mockery was entertainment, and strength was the only currency that mattered. He was leaving, would leave, when he finally managed to tear himself away as something different. Not fully adult, not yet wise, but changed in ways he couldn't articulate even to himself. The sky darkened. The second sunset arrived, painting the fever trees gold and orange and crimson. Nyota's deadline passed. With it went Kito's easy path back to the herd, back to the known world, back to the identity he'd inhabited for all 12 years of his life. He slept that night curled against the rhino's cooling body, drawing comfort from the physical presence, even though the being that had inhabited it was gone. It was irrational, he knew. The dead body was just matter now, would soon begin the process of decay that would return it to the earth. But for these few hours, in the darkness, Kito allowed himself the fiction that the old creature still lived, still breathed, still carried within him all those accumulated years of endurance. Morning came with harsh clarity. The rhino's body had stiffened overnight, the muscles contracting in rigor mortis to pull the legs into awkward angles. The smell had changed too, the first hints of putrefaction beginning their work. Within hours, the scavengers would arrive in force. The vultures first, then hyenas, finally the smaller creatures that would carry off the remaining pieces until nothing was left but bones and the disturbed earth where a battle had been fought and lost. Kito performed one final service. Using his trunk and feet, he began to pile earth and stones over the rhino's body, creating a rough cairn that wouldn't prevent scavenging, but would at least mark the spot, would acknowledge that something worth marking had occurred here. Elephants did this for their own dead, and it seemed right to extend the courtesy across species lines. As he worked, he noticed movement at the clearing's edge. His head came up, trunk rising in defensive posture, expecting the lionesses returned or perhaps hyenas drawn by scent. Instead, he saw elephants. Not the whole herd, just 3 figures. Nyota stood at the center, her massive form unmistakable even at a distance. Flanking her were 2 of the older females, reliable matrons, whose presence suggested this was no casual encounter. Kito froze, uncertain. Had they come to retrieve him? To punish him for choosing a stranger's death over the herd's migration? To witness what he'd done and pass judgment on its worth? Nyota approached slowly, her movement deliberate and formal. She stopped at the clearing's edge and extended her trunk toward the cairn, testing the air, reading the chemical story of what had occurred here. Her eyes moved from the covered rhino to Kito, and in them the young bull saw not anger, but something more complex. Assessment, perhaps, or recognition. "You stayed," she said, the rumble carrying no inflection that Kito could interpret. "I stayed. Why?" It was the same question she'd asked 2 days ago, and Kito still didn't have an adequate answer. But 2 days of vigil had taught him that some questions didn't need perfect answers, only honest ones. "Because I owed him," Kito said. "Because I was cruel when I should have been respectful. Because watching him die alone would have been," he struggled for words, "wrong. It would have been wrong." Nyota's trunk moved over the cairn, touching it with the same careful attention Kito had applied to the rhino's body. She was reading the stones, the earth, the narrative embedded in how they'd been placed. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "You made a choice, a hard choice. Many would have chosen differently. I know. The herd needed you. Your mother worried." Guilt stabbed through him. He hadn't even thought about his mother, about how his absence would affect her. The self-centeredness of youth had blinded him to everything except the immediate situation. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Are you?" Nyota's gaze pinned him. "Or are you sorry you worried her, which is different from being sorry you stayed?" The question cut to the heart of something Keto hadn't wanted to examine. Because the truth was, he wasn't sorry he'd stayed. He was sorry for the pain his choice had caused, sorry for violating the herd's expectations, sorry for a dozen secondary consequences. But the core decision? The choice to keep vigil over a dying rhino who'd shown him more dignity in death than Keto had shown him in life? That he couldn't regret. "I can't be sorry for staying," he said quietly. "I can only be sorry it had to cost something." Nyota held his gaze for another long moment, then released a rumble that might have been approval or might have been resignation. "The cost is this. You cannot fully return." The words hit like a physical blow. What? You are old enough now to make your own choices, to accept their consequences. You chose to stay here rather than follow the herd. That is your right. But the herd also has rights. The right to members who prioritize the family's survival above individual conscience. You have demonstrated that you will not always do this. "I can change. I can—" You cannot, and you should not. Her tone softened fractionally. "What you did here was not wrong, Keto. It was unusual, it was costly, but it was not wrong. It showed compassion across species lines, showed the ability to recognize duty beyond genetic obligation. These are rare qualities, valuable ones, but they make you unsuitable for life in a tightly bonded family unit." The clearing seemed to tilt beneath Keto's feet. Was she exiling him? Casting him out as a punishment? As if reading his thoughts, Nyota continued, "You may travel with us if you choose. You may benefit from the herd's protection, may feed in our territories, may call on your kin in times of need. But you are no longer bound to our migration patterns. You are free to follow your own path." One of the flanking females, McKenna, a steady presence who'd helped raise Keto from calfhood, stepped forward. "This is not punishment," she rumbled gently. "This is acknowledgement of what you've become. A bull who will make his own choices according to his own conscience. The herd cannot accommodate this and survive. But you can survive outside the herd in ways cows and calves cannot." Keto looked between them, trying to process what was being offered. Not exile exactly, not full membership either. Something in between, a liminal status that acknowledged both his connection to the family and his growing differentiation from it. "I don't understand," he said finally. "You will," Nyota replied, "in time. For now, know this. You are not rejected. You are released, to become whatever you will become." She turned to the cairn once more, and this time she added her own stones to it, selecting them carefully and placing them with the deliberation that marked all elephant interaction with death. McKenna did the same. The third female followed suit. It was, Keto realized, their way of honoring both the rhino and his choice to stay with the dying creature. When they finished, Nyota touched her trunk to Keto's forehead in a gesture of blessing or farewell, or both. "The herd moves north tomorrow," she said. "You will choose your own direction." Then they were gone, melting back into the scrub as silently as they'd arrived, leaving Keto alone in the clearing with his half-finished cairn and his uncertain future. He stood there as the sun climbed higher, as the heat built toward its midday peak, as vultures began to circle overhead with their eerily precise sense of death's timing. He'd come to this clearing a thoughtless youth. He was leaving it, what? Not a bull of the bachelor herds yet, not experienced enough to claim that status, not a herd member either, apparently. Something undefined, something still taking shape. He added more stones to the cairn, working methodically until the rhino's form was completely covered, until only a mound of earth and rock marked where a life had ended. Then he touched his trunk to the cairn's peak, committing to memory the exact configuration, the precise coordinates, the full sensory map of this place so that he could find it again if he ever needed to. "Thank you," he said to the stones, to the hidden body, to the memory of a clouded eye that had looked at him with pity and later with something that might have been respect, for teaching me what I needed to learn. Then he turned north, following not the herd's exact path, but a parallel track that would keep him loosely connected to their migration while allowing him the autonomy Noyota had granted. The savanna stretched before him, vast and indifferent and full of choices he'd have to make alone. He took his first step into this new existence, and behind him the first vulture landed on the cairn with a sound like judgment. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. 3 weeks had passed since Cateau left the clearing, and the landscape had transformed around him with the slow violence of seasonal change. The promised rains had finally arrived, turning the dust-choked savanna into a patchwork of urgent green growth. Waterholes filled, grass sprouted. The herds dispersed from their dry-season congregations into broader territories, following the moisture that now fell with daily regularity. Cateau had learned to travel alone. It wasn't easy. Every instinct bred into him over 12 years cried out for the comfort of the herd, for the rumbling conversations that stretched across miles, for the solid presence of bodies at night, for the shared wisdom of the matriarchs who'd guided every major decision of his life. But he'd adapted, because adaptation was the savanna's first commandment. He'd found other young bulls, loose confederations of adolescent males who'd also left or been pushed from their maternal herds. With them, he'd learned the rough-and-tumble social dynamics of bachelor groups, the testing, the mock fights, the flexible alliances that formed and dissolved based on convenience rather than blood. It was different from herd life, less secure but also less constrained. And Cateau discovered he had an aptitude for the negotiation it required. But tonight he traveled alone by choice. Something had been pulling at him for days now, a feeling he couldn't name but couldn't ignore, a sense of wrongness in the world that seemed to be growing stronger. He'd tried to dismiss it as imagination or the lingering effects of his vigil with the rhino, but it persisted, growing more insistent with each passing day. He was traveling north through territory that should have been familiar when he caught the scent. Blood. Recent. And beneath it, something that made his trunk curl involuntarily. The distinctive musk of young elephant calf, overlaid with the sharp tang of fear. He altered course immediately, following the scent trail with growing urgency. The blood smell intensified as he moved, joined by other scents that painted a vivid picture. Multiple elephants, agitated, predators, something burning. He found them in a shallow valley where seasonal stream had cut through soft soil, creating banks that provided some shelter, but could also become a trap. Nyata's herd, or what remained of it, had taken defensive formation around 3 young calves, the adults arranged in a living barrier of tusks and muscle. But the barrier was incomplete, punctured by a gap where 2 members should have been standing. Cateau recognized the scene immediately. Poachers. The burning smell came from a vehicle, its engine still ticking as it cooled, parked 50 meters away with headlights blazing into the herd's eyes. 2 humans moved in the darkness beyond the light, their movements purposeful and predatory. They'd already taken 2 elephants. Cateau could see the bodies at the formation's edge, his mother and McKenna, both down, both bleeding from massive wounds in their faces where tusks had been. The hacksaws the humans used for this butchery lay on the ground beside them, their blades dark with blood. Rage hit Cateau like physical force. He'd heard stories of poachers, had been warned repeatedly about their danger, but witnessing it was entirely different. These humans had killed members of his family, not for food, not even for territory, but for the ivory that was just calcium and protein to the elephants themselves, but apparently worth dying for in the human world. Nyota stood at the formation center, her trunk raised in a warning posture that trembled with fury and exhaustion. She was bleeding from a wound in her shoulder, and her left front leg bore signs of the wire snares humans sometimes set. The other adults were in similar condition, hurt, terrified, locked in the impossible situation of needing to flee but unable to abandon the calves, unable to attack without leaving the young vulnerable. The poachers apparently recognized the stalemate. One of them raised something to his shoulder, a gun, Quito realized with cold certainty, and aimed it at Nyota. At this range, with a weapon designed to bring down elephants, he couldn't miss. Quito charged. He'd never moved so fast in his life, had never channeled his body's full power into pure forward momentum. The distance between him and the humans collapsed in seconds, and he was on them before they could react, before the man with the gun could shift his aim, before thought could intervene in the beautiful clarity of instinct-driven action. His trunk caught the shooter mid-torso and lifted him, the human's weight negligible compared to the logs Quito had learned to manipulate. The gun discharged, the sound enormous and flat, the bullet going wild into the darkness. Quito threw the man, actually threw him like Jabari used to throw sticks during play sessions, and the human's trajectory ended against the vehicle with a sound of impact and breaking things. The second poacher ran, just bolted into the darkness, abandoning his partner, the vehicle, the partial harvest of ivory. His footsteps receded rapidly, terror lending speed to his flight. Quito stood there panting, his heart thundering in his chest, his muscles trembling with spent adrenaline. Around him, the night had gone silent, as if the savannah itself was holding its breath. Then Nyota's voice cut through the quiet. "Quito." He turned. The matriarch had stepped out of the defensive formation, her massive form limping slightly from the wire snare, her eyes reflecting the vehicle's harsh lights. Behind her, the other herd members remained in position, still protecting the calves, but their attention was now split between the external threats and this new variable. Quito returned in their moment of crisis. "You came back," Nyota said. And in her voice, Quito heard a complex mixture of relief and sorrow and something that might have been vindication. I scented the blood. I couldn't." His words failed. How could he explain the compulsion that had driven him here? The weeks of separation suddenly felt meaningless, the questions of herd membership or independence absurd in the face of his mother's body lying still in the dirt. He moved toward her, toward his mother, drawn by grief he hadn't had time to feel yet. She lay on her side, her trunk extended in a last frozen gesture of either attack or protection. The humans had already removed her tusks, leaving ragged wounds that leaked blood and cerebral spinal fluid. Her eyes were open, clouded with the familiar film of recent death. Quito touched her face with his trunk, the gesture gentle despite the trembling in his muscles. 2 days ago, she'd been alive, had been worrying about him if Nyota's words were to be believed. Now she was this, meat and bone and memory, reduced to resources by creatures who'd probably never thought of her as a being at all. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he didn't know what he was apologizing for. For leaving? For not being here when she needed him? For the simple fact of her death? Makena lay nearby, her body positioned as if she'd died trying to reach his mother, to offer help or comfort in those final moments. The 2 females had been close, had raised their calves cooperatively, had been part of the intricate social web that made the herd function. Both gone now, murdered for body parts that would be carved into ornaments and status symbols in some distant human city. Behind him, Noyota approached. She touched her trunk to his mother's body, then to Makena's, the gestures ritualistic and ancient. They came at dusk, she rumbled quietly. Set the snares first, to slow us. Then the noise and lights and guns. We tried to run, but the calves. She gestured to the 3 young elephants still huddled in the defensive formation. Too slow. We had to stand, had to fight. Your mother charged them. Makena followed. They died buying us time. The other poacher will return, likely with others. We need to move. Keto looked at the bodies, at the vehicle still running, at the gun lying where the thrown poacher had dropped it. An idea formed, reckless and probably stupid, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. No, he said, we need to end this. Noyota's ears spread in surprise. What? They'll keep coming. Tonight, tomorrow, next month. This herd or another. They'll keep killing because there are no consequences, because elephants run and hide and die, but never fight back in ways that matter to humans. Keto, we cannot. I know what we cannot do. I know the rules. His voice dropped to a rumble that carried undertones of the rage still coursing through him. But I also know that my mother died for pieces of her face, that Makena died, that these calves will grow up with this memory, will live in fear of lights and noise and human cruelty, because that's the world we've accepted. He turned to the vehicle, approaching it with the same careful attention he might give to a snake or scorpion. Dangerous, unpredictable, but ultimately just another feature of the landscape to be understood and navigated. The engine still ran, chugging with mechanical indifference to the violence it had facilitated. Keto could smell the fuel, could see where the liquid pooled beneath the metal body from some unseen leak. "What are you doing?" Nyota demanded. "Making sure they can't follow." He raised his trunk and brought it down on the vehicle's hood, the impact producing a satisfying crunch of folding metal. He did it again, each blow releasing some of the grief and rage that had been building in his chest since he'd found his mother's body. The vehicle structure collapsed under his assault. Glass shattered, metal crumpled. The engine coughed and died, and in its sudden silence, Keto heard the wounded poacher groaning from where he'd landed. The man was conscious then, probably injured but alive. Keto approached him slowly. The human tried to scramble backward, his face contorted in pain and terror, making sounds in his language that probably meant the same thing praise sounds meant in any language. Please, no, mercy. For a moment, Keto considered it. Considered using his tusks, his weight, his trunk. Considered teaching this human what his mother had felt in her final moments, what Makena had experienced as her life drained away. It would be justice, wouldn't it? Fair exchange for what had been taken? But looking down at this injured, frightened creature, Keto found his rage cooling into something else. Not forgiveness. He would never forgive this, but a recognition that killing this human wouldn't bring his mother back, wouldn't undo any of the night's violence, would only add another death to a tally that was already too high. He stepped over the man, ignoring his continued whimpering, and returned to where Nyota stood watching with an expression Keto couldn't quite read. "We should go," he said quietly, "while we still can." The matriarch studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She turned back to the herd, rumbling commands that sent the adults into motion. They began to move the calves north, keeping formation, staying tight. But before joining them, Nyota paused beside Keto's mother's body one final time. "We cannot take her," she said softly. "Cannot give her the burial she deserves. The humans will return, and likely take even what's left. I'm sorry." Keto touched his trunk to his mother's forehead, committing every detail to memory. The pattern of her skin, the shape of her ears, the exact configuration of her face before the humans had mutilated it. Elephants remember their dead for decades, returned to bones, and mourned them with behaviors that suggested something very much like grief. He would remember her, would carry her forward in the comprehensive mental map his species used to navigate both space and time. "Goodbye," he whispered. Then to Makena's body, "Thank you for being her friend." He turned away before the grief could paralyze him and followed the herd north, leaving behind the destroyed vehicle, the injured poacher, and the two bodies that represented everything precious that the night had stolen. They traveled through darkness, moving fast despite the calves' short legs, putting distance between themselves and the site of the attack. Keto stayed at the formation's rear, his senses alert for pursuit, but none came. Either the surviving poacher was still running, or he'd returned to find his injured partner and decided retrieval was more important than continuing the hunt. Around midnight, they paused at a water hole to rest and drink. The adults formed their defensive circle again, the pattern now automatic, though Keto noticed it was smaller than it should have been. Two fewer elephants meant gaps in the protection, vulnerabilities that would take time and careful repositioning to address. Nyota approached where Keto stood, slightly apart from the main group, still not quite member, not quite outsider. Her wound had stopped bleeding, but he could smell the infection beginning its work, could see the way she favored the leg with the snare damage. "You saved us tonight," she said without preamble. "I arrived after the worst had happened." "You drove off the poachers, destroyed their means of pursuit. That's not nothing." Keto looked at her, at the fatigue etched into every line of her massive body, and felt the weight of leadership, the terrible burden of making choices that meant life or death for those who depended on you. She'd made those choices tonight, had sacrificed his mother and Makena to buy time for the calves, and would carry that decision for the rest of her life. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said. "You were where you needed to be." Her trunk touched his shoulder, a gesture of connection that transcended simple affection. "I told you that you were released to become whatever you would become. Tonight, I saw what that might be." "What?" "A bridge between the herd and the wider world, between tradition and necessary change." Her eyes held his. "We cannot fight humans the way you fought them tonight, not as a herd. It would mean too much risk to the calves, to the structure that keeps us alive. But you're not bound by those same constraints anymore. You can act in ways we cannot." Keto felt the implications settling over him like a mantle. "You want me to hunt poachers? I want you to protect what matters, however that manifests." She paused, choosing words carefully. "The world is changing, Keto, faster than the old ways can adapt. Elephants who refuse to acknowledge this will die. But those who can find new ways to survive, new patterns of response, they might endure." "That's a lot to ask of someone who's barely past calfhood." A rumble that might have been laughter. "You're past calfhood now. You proved that tonight. And I'm not asking you to do this alone. The herd will support you when we can, but you'll need to range beyond us, learn things we cannot teach, become something we haven't seen before." She turned to rejoin the others, then looked back. "Your mother would be proud of what you did, what you're becoming. She worried you were too reckless, too thoughtless, but I think she underestimated you. We all did." Then she was gone, settling down among the other adults to rest while they could. Keto stood alone at the waterhole's edge, his reflection broken into fragments by the ripples his breathing created. He could see himself there, young, uncertain, carrying grief and rage in equal measure, and wondered if Nyota was right. If he could become this bridge she envisioned, this new thing that balanced between traditional elephant wisdom and the flexibility needed to survive in a world increasingly dominated by human violence? Or maybe he was just a traumatized adolescent being asked to shoulder responsibilities that should have belonged to his elders, because the elders themselves didn't know how to carry them anymore. A sound pulled his attention upward. Far overhead, barely visible against the cloud-covered sky, a small aircraft passed, its running lights blinking in rhythmic pattern. Quito had seen such things before. Human machines that flew like birds, but with none of a bird's grace, following routes that made sense only to human navigation. This one was low, lower than most, and something in its flight path suggested purpose rather than simple transit. Surveillance, maybe. Rangers or scientists, or even more poachers, using technology to track the herds and plan their attacks. The world was full of such things now. Vehicles and guns and flying machines, human tools that extended their reach far beyond what teeth and claws alone could manage. Elephants adapted by hiding, by learning routes that avoided human territories, by teaching their young to fear the sounds and smells that meant danger. But hiding had its limits. His mother's body proved that. Quito made a decision. Not a fully formed plan, not yet, but the seed of one. If he was going to be this bridge Nyota suggested, this new thing that could act in ways the herd couldn't, then he needed knowledge. Needed to understand humans not as abstract threats, but as knowable enemies with patterns and weaknesses and motivations that could be predicted and countered. He needed to get closer to them, to watch them, to learn. It was dangerous, probably stupid, the kind of thing that would horrify every elephant elder who'd ever taught him that humans were the ultimate threat, to be avoided at all costs. But the old wisdom had failed to protect his mother, had failed McKenna, would fail again tomorrow or next month or next year, unless something changed. Quito returned to the herd and settled down among them, his bulk fitting into the gap his mother had once occupied. The calves had fallen asleep, exhausted by terror and flight. The adults maintained their watch in shifts, ears swiveling, trunks testing the wind for threats. Tomorrow they would continue north, would resume the eternal migration, following water and grass and the ancient routes mapped in generations of memory. Quito would travel with them for a while, healing his grief, learning what Nyota could teach him about this new role she'd envisioned. But eventually, he would range beyond them, would venture into the dangerous spaces where elephant and human territories overlapped, would become something his species had never needed before but desperately needed now. He closed his eyes and tried to find sleep, though images of his mother's body and the poacher's terrified face and that overhead aircraft kept cycling through his mind. The savanna stretched around them in all directions, vast and beautiful and increasingly hostile, a landscape where the old rules no longer guaranteed survival. Change was coming, was already here. The only question was whether they could adapt fast enough to meet it. Quito had no answer, only the determination to try. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. 6 months had passed since the night of the poacher attack, and the rains had finally broken, giving way to the dry season's slow arrival. The landscape shifted its palette from green to gold, the grass drying to tinder, the waterholes shrinking back to their essential cores. Quito had changed too. He'd spent the intervening months doing exactly what he'd resolved to do, learning. He'd followed poacher tracks, observed their camps from safe distances, studied the patterns of their movements and the technologies they employed. He'd learned to recognize the difference between ranger vehicles and poacher vehicles, between conservation teams and ivory traders, between the humans who meant harm and those who meant, if not help exactly, at least no active malice. The learning had been dangerous. Twice he'd been shot at, both times escaping with only the memory of bullets passing close enough to hear their passage through air. Once he'd been tracked for 3 days, had lost them only by wading upstream through a crocodile-infested river, gambling that his size and awareness would protect him better than the certainty of human guns would destroy him. But he'd also learned things that gave him hope. He'd learned that humans were not monolithic, that factions existed within their communities, some dedicated to killing elephants, others equally dedicated to protecting them. He'd learned to identify rangers by their uniforms and equipment, had even shadowed them on patrols, had seen them arrest poachers and confiscate ivory and work with a dedication that suggested genuine care for elephant survival. Most importantly, he'd learned that humans were neither invulnerable nor incomprehensible. They followed patterns, made mistakes, showed fear and fatigue, and all the vulnerabilities that any flesh-based creature possessed. They could be opposed, outsmarted, sometimes even influenced. The knowledge sat in him like a growing thing, reshaping how he understood the world and his place in it. Today, he was returning to the clearing. He'd thought about it often in the months since he'd left. The fever trees, the cairn he'd built, the old Rhino whose death had catalyzed so much of what had followed. He'd resisted the pull for weeks, then months, telling himself it was morbid, unnecessary, that the past should stay buried under stones and earth and time. But the pull persisted, and finally, he'd stopped fighting it. The clearing looked different than he remembered. Smaller somehow, though that was probably just a trick of perspective and growth. The fever trees had put on new growth during the rainy season, their branches fuller than before. The cairn still stood, though somewhat dispersed. Animals had investigated it, scavengers had done their work, and the configuration of stones had shifted under the weight of weather and curious disturbance. Quito approached slowly, his trunk extended in the careful examination that characterized elephant investigation of death sites. The rhino's bones were still there, scattered now but identifiable. The massive skull with its broken horn, the ribs spread like architectural ruins, the leg bones lying in approximate anatomical configuration. He'd been right to come. Seeing the bones, touching them, acknowledging the material reality of death helped settle something in him that had remained restless. The old Rhino was truly gone, had been gone since that morning 6 months ago. But his being gone had created the space for Quito to become something new, and in that creation, the rhino's death carried meaning beyond simple biological termination. "I promised I'd remember you," Quito rumbled to the bones. "I have, will continue to." Movement at the clearing's edge caught his attention. His head came up, trunk rising in defensive posture, expecting predators, or perhaps other elephants drawn by his scent. Instead, he saw a rhino. Female, young, perhaps 5 years old, barely into the first bloom of maturity. She stood at the tree line, her head lowered in a posture that suggested uncertainty rather than aggression. Her horn was small and perfectly formed, her hide unmarked by the scars and battles that would come with age. She looked, Quito thought, like the old rhino might have looked decades ago, before cataracts and broken horns and whatever trauma had shaped him into the solitary creature who died here. They regarded each other across the clearing, two beings separated by species, but connected by this place and what it held. Quito lowered his trunk fractionally, a gesture of non-aggression. The young rhino took a cautious step forward, then another, her head swiveling to keep both eyes on him while also examining the clearing itself. She approached the scattered bones with the careful deliberation of her kind, testing the air, processing information that Keto could only guess at. Did rhinos recognize the remains of their own species? Did she know what she was looking at, understand the story written in skull and bone? She touched her horn to the old rhino's skull, the gesture gentle, almost reverent. Then she did something Keto didn't expect. She began to rebuild the cairn. It was clumsy work. Rhinos lacked the sophisticated trunk manipulation that made elephants such accomplished engineers, but she managed it nonetheless, using her horn and front feet to push stones back into position, recovering the scattered bones with patient determination. Keto watched for a moment, then moved to help. His trunk made the work easier, more efficient, and together they restored the cairn to something approximating its original configuration. They worked in silence, communicating only through the occasional glance or adjustment of position. Two creatures from different species collaborating on a task that benefited neither but seemed important to both. When they finished, the young rhino stepped back and looked at Keto directly. In her dark eyes, he saw something that reminded him of that final look from the old rhino. Not pity this time, but understanding. Acknowledgement that they'd both been changed by this place and what had happened here. She turned and walked to the clearing's far edge, then paused and looked back. An invitation? A farewell? Keto couldn't tell. But he rumbled a low sound of goodwill, and she seemed to hear it, her ear flicking in response before she disappeared into the scrub. Keto stood alone with the restored cairn and wondered if the young rhino had known the old one, if she'd been looking for him and found instead this grave and the elephant who'd built it. Or maybe it was pure coincidence, two beings drawn to the same place by currents too subtle to name. Either way, he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of completion, of circles closing in ways he hadn't known they needed to close. A sound pulled his attention skyward. The aircraft again, or one like it, following a route that would take it over the clearing. Keto tracked its passage, noting the speed, the altitude, the slight deviation from the straight line that suggested active piloting rather than automated flight. Rangers, probably, monitoring the herds, watching for poacher activity. Part of the human faction that meant protection rather than harm. The aircraft's shadow passed over the cairn, over Keto, over the clearing where death and vigil and unexpected alliance had reshaped the trajectory of one young elephant's life. Then it was gone, its engine sound fading into the ambient noise of the savannah. Keto turned north, orienting himself toward where he'd last encountered Nyota's herd. He'd visit them, contribute what he could to their protection and survival, learn more of the wisdom the matriarch had promised to teach him. Then he'd range out again, continue his education in the dangerous art of understanding enemies, continue becoming this bridge between old elephant traditions and the brutal necessities of a changed world. But first, one more thing. He moved back to the cairn and added a final stone, selecting it carefully, smooth and dark, shaped by water into something almost perfectly round. He placed it at the cairn's apex, where it caught the afternoon light, and held it like a promise. "For teaching me," he said to the stones, to the bones they covered, to the memory of a clouded eye that had looked at him with pity, and later with something approaching respect. "For showing me what mattered." Then he walked north, his shadow stretching long across the clearing as the sun began its descent. And behind him, the cairn stood solid and silent, marking the place where a young elephant had learned the difference between cruelty and compassion, between strength and wisdom, between surviving and truly living. 3 years passed. Keto grew into his full bulk and strength, his tusks curving outward in the elegant architecture that marked prime bulls. He became known among the ranger teams as the Guardian, the young bull who appeared when poachers operated in his territory, who'd been seen destroying their vehicles and driving off their attacks, who seemed to possess an almost uncanny knowledge of human patterns and behaviors. Some rangers credited him with saving dozens of elephants, possibly more. Some thought the stories exaggerated, the product of desperate hopes projected onto an ordinary elephant who happened to be in the right place at opportune times. Quito didn't care about the stories or the credit. He simply continued the work, following the path that had opened before him in a clearing beneath fever trees, guided by the memory of an old rhino who'd shown him that death with dignity was possible, that cruelty could be answered with compassion, that the young could learn from the old, even, especially, when the lessons came wrapped in mockery and mud. He visited the cairn once a year, always alone, always bringing a stone to add to the pile. The mound grew slowly, becoming a landmark of sorts, though few knew what it marked or why it stood where it did. On his fourth annual visit, he found fresh flowers placed among the stones, wildflowers that hadn't grown there naturally, that showed signs of human arrangement. A small wooden marker had been driven into the ground beside the cairn, carved with words Quito couldn't read, but that carried the weight of human respect, human remembrance. Someone knew. Some human had found this place, had understood what it represented, had chosen to honor it. Quito stood there as the sun set, his trunk resting gently on the stones, and felt the full weight of everything that had flowed from that stupid, cruel moment at the waterhole. His mother's death, his education in human ways, his growing role as protector, the unexpected alliance with rangers who now sometimes coordinated their patrols with his movements. The old rhino had been right to look at him with pity that day. Quito had been young and foolish and thoughtless, deserving of pity and more. But the rhino had also been wrong, in a way, because within that foolish youth had existed the possibility of growth, of learning, of transformation into something better. The savanna stretched around him in all directions, beautiful and harsh and full of life persisting against all odds. Somewhere to the north, Nyota's herd grazed in peace, protected by rangers Quito had helped guide to poacher camps. Somewhere to the east, young bulls played and fought and learned, preparing themselves for the complex social navigation that adult life would require. Somewhere to the south, the young rhino, if she still lived, continued her own journey, carrying forward whatever the old rhino had taught her through genetics or the mysterious transmission of wisdom that seemed to flow between beings who shared territory and time. And here, in this clearing, stones marked where it had all begun. Quito added his yearly stone, perfectly round again, shaped by forces beyond his understanding, into something that felt right. He placed it carefully, adjusting its position until it sat exactly where it belonged. "Thank you," he said one final time, then turned and walked into the gathering dark, his massive form soon invisible against the landscape, indistinguishable from shadow and tree and the other large shapes that moved through the African night. The cairn remained, silent and patient, holding its memories, waiting for whatever would come next. Because something always did.